like Reagan said, I'm Jordan Hoffner. I work as a QA engineer on the StackVision product. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So some of the 7.5 feature changes that we made were changes to the installer, email groups or alarm emailing, some ProcessNow changes, data lab, XScript, some OPC UA improvements, some changes to preview features, and then of course ECMPS 2.0 and MATS PM tests and quarterly compliance. Something to note about the MATS changes is that for those of you that are aware, the EPA has postponed some of the deadline on this stuff, so this is our best guess at implementation right now. A lot of this stuff is behind that preview feature, so yeah, that portion of it is subject to change, but I'll explain a little bit more as we go through it. All right, so we're going to start off with the installer. So we had a request to officially support separate SQL installations, or sometimes called a split server environment, where you have the StackVision application installed on one server and then the SQL database installed on another server. In order to kind of do this cleanly, note that this really only affects new installs, maybe server migrations, stuff like that. But just to be aware. But now, when installing StackVision for the first time, we used the SQL-defined default locations for those database files instead of the installation location defined in the installer steps, which I'll show. And this is really designed to prevent issues that we would see where, again, specifically split server, where there would be permissions issues on one server compared to another, or an install path or drive may not even exist. There's kind of some expectations that they're going to look similar, and that might not be the case between the two servers. So this is a fix for that use case, but it does actually affect all StackVision installs. So when going through the installer, there's a step here where you define your installation location. In prior versions of StackVision, this location would be used for both the application and the database files. Now, really, this is just for the application files themselves. The database files are actually going to use the SQL default locations. So that's defined in SSMS here. So what you would want to do, have a DBA or an admin go in there and update these if needed to prior to upgrading StackVision, or it can actually be done after the fact too. But just to note that the default install location has changed in 7.5. And here's an example of what that would look like if the C/database files drive or file structure was used on the install. And we can see our database files here on the right. We made some changes to email groups and or alarm emailing again, and this is really to fix problems that we saw with the last rework. We really just kind of simplified things to be more consistent, and to fix some situations where people would getting emails that they weren't expecting, really just to fix a few bugs. Again, really the purpose for this was to eliminate emails that would happen when you configure email groups from alarms that actually occurred prior to that. So there was some situations where something would update that alarm, like an acknowledge or some other situations that would actually cause an email to be sent out kind of unexpectedly for an old historical email or old historical alarm. So really the purpose for this is just to make sure that when alarm's triggered, an email is sent if it's configured, right? That's how it should work. And then when alarm returns to normal, an email is sent when it returns to normal if it's configured at that time. And there should really be no like edge cases and considerations and what if this. It should really just be that black and white. So we removed some dependencies on timestamps, such as mod date, which is like the main one with alarms. And just generally rework the logic to be more consistent and really just simple. Something to note here, that this is a situation I think that probably needs to be explained, but just to, I guess, kind of clarify that the email is sent at the time that it is configured, right? If it's configured, it triggers at that point. So in this example, we see at the start here, we don't have an email group or return to normal or anything configured. An alarm occurs, so we receive no email, right? For the alarm condition, we receive no email. So that alarm, sits there active. At some point, that alarm, gets configured for an email group, and return to normal is set. So let's say some more time passes, and at some point that alarm eventually returns to normal. And a return to normal email would be sent in that case because it was configured prior to the return to normal. It doesn't necessarily have to be configured prior to the alarm condition. The only thing that matters there is this email. For the initial alarm condition, it would have to be configured prior. So there are two separate things, and as long as one is configured, or it is configured for each one before the state happens, whether that's the alarm condition or the return to normal, then the appropriate email will be sent now. Something that we've overlooked is the Knox correlation. The SV Knox core ProcessNow task we found was overwriting lock data. So now it respects that lock flag, and it prevents data from being changed. Obviously, when that task runs over the locked data. Now, we added support for subnode 75. ProcessNow task, which is the non-part 75 data substitution task, to run on intervals other than 1 hour, specifically 15-minute. For those that aren't familiar with this task, it's a very simple data substitution where you either take the hour before or the hour after if it's there, and you can even do an average of the two if you need to. In the arguments of the task, you can kind of specify how you want the substitution to work, but it's kind of what we call like a very simple data substitution. So now that works on the 15-minute interval as well. And then there is an even improved performance for a really simple form of hour before, hour after substitution, which already worked with 1 hour, but is now expanded to work with the 15-minute as well. I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but you can see here we have the other arguments for that task. This is where you kind of specify. So a certain set of arguments, when they're defined, we get this new high performance logic. This is all kind of documented, so if we need to implement something like this, I don't want to go into too much detail in this presentation, but yes. We added improvements to the controller tools when downloading features, and that backup that occurs. We expanded that to support backing up of the Modbus configuration or the server.cfg file if it exists on the controller. Note that it is only applicable when the controller actually has an active Modbus configuration, but in prior versions, when you download from StackVision to the data controller and you enter your admin credentials here, we would create a backup of the data controller for historical record keeping purposes, or just backups of the record before changes get saved. Now in 7.5, we also back up a server.cfg file when it's present, because it can be modified by that download, right? So this is what it would kind of look like if a server.cfg file or the Modbus configuration does exist and we download and choose to back up. We would get a prompt for the backup of the data controller and a separate one for the Modbus configuration. If the server.cfg file does not exist, all you would see is just this top portion here. It automatically detects if it exists and backs it up. If it doesn't, there's no extra input needed. In Data Lab, we made a small update to method code descriptions, and this was for part of the PM changes that we made. So method codes 36 and 68 were updated to include PM in the descriptions. XScript, we made a pretty big change to, actually. And this was so that, well, so the keywords no longer match by wildcard is the high level, but really this was to solve a problem where XScript keywords or names that look similar, which I'll explain, could not be used as variable names because it would confuse the parsing logic. So it would think that you're using a keyword when you're not actually using a keyword. So and it would appear as syntax issues and errors when you're running. And in some cases, people would actually have to work around this by choosing non-ideal, or not what they wanted to choose for source and parameter names to kind of work around the problem. A good example of this is we would use like wildcards so that something looked like a keyword, it would be used as a keyword. So like the shutdown keyword for the field on a data point or our data lab field. So if you use the keyword shut or shut, it would try to use that as a variable. But if you had a parameter name that you were trying to use called like shut op hour for your shutdown operating hours, it would confuse that as a keyword because of the wildcard matching, and it would result in an error. So basically, it wasn't smart enough to recognize the difference. So we made some changes to that parsing logic so that it can recognize the difference between that source and parameter pattern, and then plain string assignment, or just using variables. And now they're handled appropriately. It's smart enough to notice the difference between the two. In order to do that, we had to remove wildcard matching, which is that basically, like if something was SUSS or something for suspect, that's actually technically incorrect. It's only SUS or SUSPECT, right? Suspect. But it was close enough, and before it would actually work. So there is a risk here that it could possibly break some XScripts that had what would be a syntax error, but worked because of wildcard matching. We don't think that there's any intentional wildcard matching out there, but we think that the risk is the reward is worth the risk, right? It's something that needed to be done. You shouldn't have to worry about your source and parameter names and things when you're creating your configuration or when you're adding new parameters to the thing, just because at some point down the road it might be used with XScript, and then if it breaks things and you have to retroactively go and change a bunch of stuff just to kind of work around it. It's really an issue for our engineers, but we've definitely had customer complaints and stuff as well. So it's something that's been requested for a long time. We made some pretty significant changes to our OPC Data Manager service as well. One of these was securing our client username and password credentials on the StackVision server. So there is a client security.cfg file that already existed in prior versions. Basically, this was a username and password that was defined to connect to an OPC UA server if that server required it, if it required username and password authentication to log in to create that connection. This file was used for that. Now in 7.5, we actually encrypt that file, so it's not sitting there in plain text on the StackVision server. So this is what this is where the file lives in StackVision application server and OPC. You use a text editor to edit, and you would basically set your URL, your username and password. It's sort of like a host file, if you're familiar with that, to connect. Now in 7.5, whenever the service starts up, for those of you that are already using this, it'll automatically encrypt when you update and services start up. In the case of a new setup or a new OPC UA environment, then what you would actually have to do is, this is what the file looks like. So before, you would just have it sitting in plain text on the machine. Everything is really commented out except for this line right here, but you can see there's a URL, the OPC UA server URL, and then a username and password. In this case, it is literally username and password, but this would be converted into this, actually the whole file, when the service starts up. If you need to make changes to it, basically what you would do is go in here, delete all of this, make the changes, and then copy paste it over and save and restart the service, and it'll re-encrypt everything. This is basically the simplest approach to this problem without having lots of UI changes and having somewhere in maybe the data mapper application to kind of do this. It's also used by the data mapper as well as the service itself. So this is basically the simplest approach to this. But yeah, the next thing that we added was supporting browse paths for mapping. So there were situations where tags or node IDs are some random alphanumeric string of characters. In some cases, we've seen 32 characters, just random random characters that are not human readable, right? They're not logical. They don't make any sense. So a way to get around that so that people can kind of look at their mapping and they can see what's mapped to what. For debugging purposes, we implemented browse paths to the data mapper and the data manager service. So in prior versions, this first screenshot here is a CSV file open in Excel. So we have our different parts of the CSV. We have our URL, a namespace, the tag, and then on the right side is our StackVision stuff, the target parameter and intervals and whatnot. With typical tags, typical OPC tags, you have a namespace here, and then you have the tag itself. Those are kind of concatenated together, create this source item, and that's how our tags were created. Something to note is that when you're using the data mapper and kind of dragging tags to manually create mappings, they're still going to look like this. They're still going to use the traditional tag ID to create them. Anyways, this tag is readable. It makes sense. The highest node in this is channel 1, and then it goes to device 2, and then lookup table 1, and that's kind of the hierarchy of this tag. It makes sense. But if this was some just, it could just be numbers, it could be alphanumeric, it could be anything really. It depends on the server how this tag and node is set up. So the browse path to that looks very similar. So we have our objects at the highest level, channel 1, device 2, and then the raw tagged data is at the lowest level, and that's what we're actually going to be pulling from. So it's sort of like a tree level or like a hierarchical view of those tags. So in this case, whenever for implementation purposes, the CSV would have no namespace defined for these type of tags where we're using our browse path, and then we would actually just define it here in the OPC tag side. Whenever you actually start the service, what happens is we translate that. Here's a similar example, but it is different. So we could see that when we start our services, we actually translate what's a node of this browse path here to a node ID that is not helpful. Really, the tag here is just 1014, which doesn't really make any sense. But if we actually look at the browse path, we can kind of work out what that tag would be. So polling still happens on node ID, regardless of if you're using a browse path or nodes, and it could be a mix match of both in the same mapping file. But when the service starts up, the first thing that happens before any polling occurs is we're going to translate that browse path into a node ID and start polling all tags by node IDs. If for some reason we have like a typo or just incorrectly defined browse path, we would actually see a bad no match here before, you could see before our timers start and before we actually start pulling anything. Yeah, so this is to support maybe a niche situation, but should be useful. And then the last thing was with finally adding subscriptions as a data retrieval type. So we introduced a new scan behavior to the OPC data mapper, which is performed by the data manager service, which allows us to change from a traditional polling every, like every once a minute or whatever we'll pull for a new data point, to a subscription model, which is the server actually pushing data to us, the client, when new data is available, which means we really only write data to StackVision when updates occur instead of every so often, every defined interval. So a really useful example of this would be calibration expected values or cal gas bottle values, right? If you're getting those, if that data is stored in a historian and we want to pull that data into StackVision, there's no reason to pull that data once a minute or even once a day, right? It updates every few years or however long it takes for that to expire or get used. So subscriptions would be the perfect implementation of something like that. Or something that where the tag updates frequently enough that we can use subscriptions to pull data. For environmental compliance, we have to have data every so often to create valid intervals. So it might not make sense. In fact, the default is still going to be that traditional polling type, every once a minute or whatever. But for certain cases where subscriptions make sense, subscriptions are really the preferred OPC UA way of getting data. That's it's the preferred polling method. So we should at least have that as an option. So in the data mapper now, we added this scan behavior column, and again, it defaults to polling, but it's a drop down where we can select either polling or subscriptions. When polling is selected, when subscriptions are selected, our scan interval and scan type are disabled. They're like grayed out there, so because they're not actually being used. It's just the server pushing us data whenever it updates. All right, in preview feature changes, it's going to look a little bit different in 7.5. So now we have MATS emission JSON and MATS QA/QC JSON option, which provide the ability to report that MATS data in the JSON EDR. And then we made some updates to the MATS quarterly compliance editor, which include adding manual deviations to performance tests. So the preview feature looks like this now. The top option giving us those MATS quarterly compliance feature UIs, and then the bottom two are enabling the MATS data into the JSON EDR. There's two different toggles, one's for emission and one is for QA/QC. So basically, there actually used to be two different places where you would choose if you wanted that MATS data to be present in the EDR when you generate the JSON file. Now, if this is checked, anytime you generate a JSON EDR, for this would be emissions JSON, it will include the MATS data in it, and that's as simple as it is, or as simple as it gets. So. The first option here again is giving access to the quarterly compliance UI options, and then the others are for, again, when you're generating that EDR, it will include MATS data in it. A note is that again, the schema for a lot of this mat stuff is not official. It hasn't actually been released yet, so this is our best guess at what it's going to look like, and indefinitely subject to change. And that's why it's hidden behind this preview feature. Knox backstop we added to the JSON EDR as well. Not really much to say here, but it's added in 7.5. The MATS MHV PM concentration. So we added that to the JSON emissions EDR as well, which is again in accordance with the new MATS 2.0 reporting instructions. This stuff gets configured in Stack Studio EDR templates. Once it's configured and we have PMC configured there, then it will be present in the EDR when it's generated. And same for PM tests. So we made some improvements, and this was based on some updated schema changes that we received or that were provided by the EPA, and then reporting instruction changes. So we made some small changes to the PM test data and the way that it's reported in the QA/QC. Another note here saying that the schema is not finalized. ACA UI updates. So we needed the ability to have a new result code of pass APS. So we needed to add that test result and new related formula types. And then for PM correlation tests, we disabled the reporting in the EDR when this result code is configured. So again, it prevents a test with test result pass APS from displaying in the EDR because it's not a supported test result by the reporting instruction. So before, there was actually a toggle here to choose whether you wanted it present or not when that test result's configured. Now it's actually disabled. So just a note, if you already have a test that was set up where we have the test result as pass APS and report in EDR was checked, it'll actually look like it's checked. It'll just be disabled and it won't actually report. We added run numbers to the SVA editor. That's just to be more consistent with the other PM test editors. So we just missed this, and the runs weren't actually defined. So we added that column. It's now visible in 7.5. MATS CMS deviation events report. So this looks very similar to another report, but this is used to determine deviations using the new is deviation code rather than just reason codes and missing invalid and OOC. That this is deviation was added in the last few releases to Data Lab and XScript and a few other places. The reports in the Part 63 directory, MATS CMS deviation events, and it's very similar to the CMS downtime deviation events report, and the options are the same. Just a note that in order for items to show up on this report, the hourly points must be missing, invalid, or OOC, and then it must have the is deviation or deviation is true for those data points, again, instead of looking at reason codes. We updated the PM test reports to include new test options that were required for the ECMPS 2.0 reporting. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but here's an example of what the new ACA report looks like. And SVA, RRA, RCA, And there's a note here that says a warning will display if a correlation test is not associated with the RCA now. We now have the option to group by span in the RCA report. PM correlation report. And then we also have the group by span in the PM correlation report. We made a small change to, this is a preview feature area, the MATS quarterly compliance. So now we can select records by, or search records by multi-year, whereas prior it was, you could only search 1 year at a time. This is a shared UI piece between fuel usage, malfunctions, and unit information. So now we can search multiple years when looking for records. And then this is a new UI area for the MATS quarterly compliance. Again, preview feature. And this is for deviations, which are required by the MATS quarterly compliance reporting. Before it was just fuel usage, malfunction, and performance test. No, not performance test. Unit information. So in 7.5 we added manual deviations, and then I'll be going over performance tests in a second. The UIs look very similar. If you've looked at them before, they'll look and feel exactly the same. Not exactly, mostly the same between them all. And then our required fields being showing validation error because they need to be filled out. Whenever you create it, it'll go to a display view where it'll show that record and it can be edited. And again, performance tests was the thing I just mentioned, the MATS quarterly compliance for ECMPS 2.0. That is the other item here in that UI. This one's a little bit different. So because these are more complex records, we chose to go with a wizard to create them. So when you progress through that wizard, it'll kind of simplify, creating those records, defining the location parameter code, mission limit and method, creating those tests, and then conversion parameters and QA parameters. Once it's actually created, there's a little search screen here. Once you select it, then you can kind of get into that record, and we have some tabs here. We have our test summary data, our runs, conversion parameters, and QA parameters, and each of those has their own UI to edit or add data or runs to that test summary data. And then obviously it needs to be reported, so we added it to the JSON QA/QC EDR after being created. That's about it for the major feature changes. So we're going to go through some bug fixes. This is a funny one, but dashboard tables, if the show unit of measure and caption option was enabled for a parameter, anytime you made changes to the flag colors, priority, or any sort of changes to the flag colors for that parameter, it wouldn't save. It was due to a order of operations issue on the load, actually. So it would try to save it, but whenever it would reload it back up, it wouldn't actually take effect. So now it doesn't matter what captions you have to add it or on parameters, it'll save like you would expect it to. Another dashboard table issue that we ran into where an instant interval would just randomly appear. We had one customer that ran into this, and they just had a really, really massive dashboard with tons of tables on it and intervals. So it actually had to do with kind of a stress test situation. It was a really sizable dashboard with lots of controls. A race condition would happen where it would actually. I think the issue is that when a table loads by default, an instant interval is the first thing that appears. So whenever it was loading tons of them at the same time, that instant interval would just randomly appear, even though it wasn't actually saved with it on there. So now that doesn't happen. We don't have any random intervals appearing in tables, regardless of how big they are. When the data roles task was defined without an interval, it would actually cause an exception. So there was no Stack Studio validation. The editor would actually let you save without a defined interval, but when the sequence was ran, we would see an error when you look at it in a ProcessNow report. It's because there was no interval defined. So we added validation to Stack Studio, so an interval must be defined before you can actually save your changes. If for some reason that isn't true, or maybe on upgrade you had a data roles task that was set like that, it'll actually fail gracefully. And I think it gave us a really a non-obvious error, so we had to track down what the problem was. Now it'll actually fail gracefully and tell us that there's no interval defined, so it should be an obvious fix. We fixed, or I guess made changes to Event Lab, XScript, and data roles, so that when you're writing data values, default reason code, action code, and method code are now being set, whereas previously it would be left null. So you could use those tools to make changes to data, or in some cases just create data where there wasn't any before. However, reason code, action codes, and method codes would be left null, and those are actually necessary for certain reports to work. So it would cause problems. The reports wouldn't actually generate. I think there were exceptions. I'm not sure. Anyways, now those tools apply default method or default codes whenever we're setting data. We recently made this change to OPC as well, but this is something that happens when you're pulling from a data controller. When data comes in, even if you're not writing to reason code, action code, and method code, the defaults are always going to be applied. So basically now any place that should be writing data to StackVision should also be applying those default codes. Flow to load was using an incorrect limit. So when apply BAF was checked, we would have a fail when it was supposed to be a pass, or vice versa, and it actually caused an eSynPS error message. So per the rule, when a normal load RADA is above 60 megawatts and apply BAF is checked, the limit for the average percent difference should actually be 10%, not 15. So in this case, it passed where it actually should have failed. So we can see here nothing actually changed with this data, but with the fix in place, using the correct limit, the flow to load test failed. Small typo in the OPC data mapper. If an instance was already running, it would say the app location is already running. Small fix, typo. This is an issue where it's actually, I believe, a new configuration problem. If you are importing, maybe in some cases setting up a test environment, or I don't think server migration would really apply, but if you're importing a configuration where your email groups are configured, right here, it actually wouldn't properly parse that data and import and save. So it would give an error, and now it doesn't. And the same was actually true for EDR templates. When you're importing a configuration prior to 7.4 into 7.5, a blank configuration, when you're importing that in, well, when you're importing a configuration into a blank database, I should say, we can see And prior, this is what it was, what those EDR templates looked like in 7.4. And this is the same configuration imported into 7.5 StackVision. Only one template actually migrated over. And the averaging groups didn't display. So now with the fix, the EDR templates properly import and averaging group configuration properly displays. I don't know if this is necessarily a bug fix, but we had some cases where during testing where we would use outdated schemas, and we would see random side effects. It would create rogue database entries, and it would cause places where you would expect to see a monitoring plan would actually look. It would look like there was a record there, but it was like a blank record, and it caused problems. So this is sort of a preemptive measure, but now we try to parse that schema and make sure that the monitoring plan that's trying to be imported at the time matches the current version, the current schema for that version of StackVision. We had an issue where when importing and saving a JSON monitoring plan, the component begin and end dates would be nulled out. These used to exist, so going from an XML monitoring plan over to a JSON, this would happen, and it would prevent the MMHV from displaying in the JSON EDR. Little note here is that if this did happen, you could just go back to XML and it would reverse the problem. But we fixed that so that the component begin and end dates are now properly saved when importing that JSON monitoring plan, and the data displays in the EDR. In the EDR generator, the text would always say generating XML and JSON EDR. Regardless of what file type you actually had select here, it would say it was generating both. And that was fixed. So when you have XML selected, it'll say XML, vice versa for JSON and both, if you have both selected. We ran into a critical error testing importing with the schema that we had in 7.4, and this was the error decal30J and decal30C missing upscale gas type codes. So we weren't properly reporting this in the JSON EDR file. So in 7.4 we include that in the record. We can kind of see that here, and that resolves that critical error when trying to evaluate the EDR. We had an issue where the MATS PM SVA results would actually be updated when changing the reference and SIM values, specifically to 0. So we could see here they were set to 0, and the calculation didn't actually change, and it's saying suspicious values. And now we set them to 0, and it's divide by 0 issue probably, but that properly updates now. MATS PM SVA tests were not saved also when clicking off the tab, so we would make some changes to it, and they would revert back to the original values when switching tabs, instead of kind of keeping in place until it was saved. Now, after editing the values and saving the edited values, display as expected when switching back to that tab. A small change to unit information is just a sorting issue, where time of line parameters were not properly ordered ascending. That's all I have.
If that's everything, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jordan, for your great presentation, and we'll talk to you guys soon.